We begin as we begin with all quick prep applique. We trace the pattern on the wrong side of the background fabric. In the case of skinny stems, it is only necessary to trace a single line. We'll work from there, kind of eyeballing it from there. As with any other type of quick prep applique, we will use the pin method of placement to decide where we should place our applique fabric on the front. I have placed pins directly on the pencil line. I can flip it over and add my applique fabric. I'll pin it in place on the front side. This is so there are no pins on the back side that are obstructing or catching our basting threads as we work. I go to the back, remove the pins, and I'm now ready to baste directly on that line. I have chosen a basting thread that contrasts well with my applique fabric. I am going to do the quick prep applique stitch. Let me get a little bit closer for you here. Directly on the line. Here we go. I'm going to go straight down in through both layers of fabric. That is my background and my applique fabric on the front. I'm going to push forward a little bit, not too far, just about 1/8 of an inch. Pull my thread up. I'll take and make my next stitch by placing the point of my needle 1 to 2 background threads ahead of where my thread came out and push forward 1/8 of an inch or so. Once again, 1 to 2 background threads ahead of where I came out, and I push through. My basting stitches don't really show up well on the back side. I have just little tiny specks of stitches on the back. Let me clip this and I'll show you the front. We have transferred the edge of our applique to the front. It's now time to trim our stem. First, I'll get rid of the pins holding the applique fabric in place. I am going to take and first cut, using my serrated scissors, a 1/4 inch seam allowance at the end. This is the part that will eventually slide underneath another patch. Okay, let me get around here and we'll do the same on this end, about a 1/4 inch seam allowance at the end. Now the next step I do is strictly optional. I have found it difficult sometimes to handle this as I am working and find that it is easier or better if I take the time to place a basting stitch opposite the edge that I'm about to turn under. So I'm going to come in here and baste this edge down, just a couple long stitches. It doesn't take very much, but I don't want it moving on me while I'm stitching. You may not need this step. As I said, this is just something that may be a problem for me and not for everyone. If it is a problem for you, this is the way to solve it. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to stitch the inside curve first. So I am going to trim it now, and I am going to trim it wider than I normally trim my applique. I'm going to trim this at a 1/4 inch wide. That's a lot wider than I usually do, but I'll show you why in just a minute. Once I have done that, because it is an inner curve, I am going to relieve that. I'm clipping in several clips that are going between 2/3 and 3/4 of the way into the seam allowance. I don't want to get too terribly close to the basted thread, to the edge that I'll be turning under. If I get too close, I could end up with inner pokies, and we don't want those. Okay. It's just the same as any of my quick prep applique. I begin by clipping every other stitch for 2 or 3 stitches. After removing my basting thread, I'm going to take my applique needle threaded with silk thread in the same color as my stem. I'm going to bury the knot in the seam allowance there and take my first applique stitches. Adjust your seam allowance if you need to. Remember, if it isn't perfect before you put those stitches in, it sure won't be afterwards. I'm going to go ahead and do my applique stitch up till I get to my next basting thread, at which point I'll turn under the next section. So why don't I go ahead and applique this edge, and I'll get right back to you. I have completed the applique of the inner curve on my skinny stem, and it is now time to cut out the other side. I'll leave my thread in my fabric. I will continue on down the other side with that thread in just a moment. First, I'm going to come in and clip my basting thread down here and get it out of here. Okay, there we go. Next, I'm going to turn my work and pull back the top fabric. And we see the seam allowance under here with all its little tiny clips. We are going to trim that just as close as we can. And that is why I have left them extra long. It just helps at this point to have more fabric to grab a hold of when cutting it really, really narrow. That may sound counterintuitive, but hey, it works. Okay, so I'm going to come in and really, really, really close. Let me get my other scissors here. I prefer these. Okay, here we go. We're going to clip really, really close to our seam allowance. Remember, if you're having a skinny stem, let's say an 1/8 of an inch stem, this seam allowance can't be over an 1/8 of an inch. If it is, you can't turn it under and make it work. You're going to have this side sticking out. So get this as narrow as you can get it without cutting your applique fabric. We'll get rid of all the little pieces here. And we're just about ready for the really fun step. And I know it's a scary step, but you know what? That's okay. We are going to trim our seam allowance. And let's stop and think for a minute about how wide we want this. If we want an 1/8 of an inch skinny stem, how wide can we cut this? Well, if we cut it 1/4 of an inch and turn under an 1/8 of an inch, that will probably work pretty well. So I am going to cut it at 1/4 of an inch, or maybe just a tad narrower. And I know this is the scary part, but it's well worth doing. So just grab a hold and let's go. I'm going to be at a little under 1/4 of an inch, or maybe close to 1/4 inch. I'm cutting this as evenly as I possibly can. The evenness of the cut will help you enormously. Okay, there we have our cut. And now we're going to turn it under. Now I know y'all think this is really, really hard, but I'm here to tell you it is one of the easiest things you will ever do. Flip it under. Oopsie, there we go. Flip it under, finger press it so it doesn't get away from you. And then let's take our thread and bring it out the fold on the other side. Because we've cut it evenly, it is going to be fairly easy. And you will find that you can do these skinny, skinny little stems with no problem at all. In fact, they're going to be one of the easiest things you do. Actually, I may have it a little too turned under, so I'm going to pull it back up. Stop and look at it. By all means, look at it. Be sure it is the way you want it. Now, this has turned out to have an end down here that's just a tad wider than the rest of the stem. That is not going to matter, because that end that is just a tad wider is going to slide underneath another patch and be covered. So you won't see this down here to look like that. And you have a skinny, skinny little stem. You can see in comparison to my thimble. Let me grab a ruler. Well, I have found my ruler. Let's measure this. We can take and slide the little lever here up and down. And as we do that, we see that this little skinny stem is exactly 1/8 of an inch wide. Skinny stems can add a real wow factor to your quilts. I hope you have enjoyed this video as much as I've enjoyed making it for you. Please check out my other applique videos for more of my quick prep applique techniques. Until next time, happy appliquing.